With the current political climate in society right now, I've been seeing a lot more white women discuss the concept of matriarchy. And that's great and all, but it's still giving very much white feminism. But these concepts didn't come out of thin air for them. They've come across these concepts written by white academics whose whole research and studies is based around who? Indigenous, matriarchal, and matrilineal societies. Without giving credit, I think white women need to take a step back and seek guidance and leadership from the Black and brown women of these exact communities.
A viral article published by CHIX Magazine advocates for a shift from patriarchal structures to matriarchal ones in Western societies, emphasizing the need for societal transformation led by women. Rematriation has been taken up by feminist, ecological, and spiritual movements as a way to describe a return to values associated with the feminine, the earth, and communal care. Rematriation is a response to our current political climate, wherein political legislators are limiting women's rights and freedoms, namely regressing reproductive politics decades by revoking reproductive rights in America, limiting trans freedoms in America, and allowing men abusers to take up positions of political power in American society. Some key focuses of the rematriation movement include ecological restoration. Many environmental movements use rematriation to describe reconnecting to the land through sustainable and regenerative practices, often in contrast to extractive patriarchal models. There's also a discussion of feminist reclamation under movements of rematriation. Some feminists use the term to signify a shift away from patriarchal structures and societies towards more nurturing, community-oriented, and holistic ways of organizing in societies. And rematriation also focuses on spiritual and cultural renewal of the feminine. So it really leans into New Age philosophy, specifically goddess centered spiritualities. Rematriation is invoked as a return to that matriarchal wisdom and those traditions, and an emphasis on divine femininity. The challenge is that this usage often detaches rematriation from its Indigenous-specific political, legal, and land-based meanings. It's crucial to recognize that the concept of rematriation originates from Indigenous communities in North America, where it signifies the return and revitalization of traditional Indigenous matriarchal values and practices. So, for instance, the rematriation movement, led by Indigenous women, focuses on restoring cultural traditions, reconnecting with ancestral lands, and healing from colonial impacts. Krina Gould, a prominent figure in this movement, describes rematriation as reclaiming traditional land and sacred sites to rebuild cultures and heal colonization. Erasing the decolonial lens of rematriation recenters the perspectives of white women and neglects consciousness raising around the impacts of white bodies in settler colonial and imperial societies. Further, the appropriation of rematriation by non-Indigenous feminist groups without proper acknowledgement can perpetuate the marginalization of Indigenous knowledge. This underscores the importance of understanding and respecting the origins of such concepts to avoid cultural appropriation and ensure that Indigenous contributions are recognized and valued. Fifth wave feminism is deeply tied to digital freedoms and the shifting contexts under which women are able to represent themselves in Western societies through digital media. Digital feminists disrupt control societies through decentralized digital organizing and feminist image circulation by creating forms of community online. Fifth wave feminism rejects hierarchical leadership and embraces collective grassroots organizing, often through social media and digital activism. So, movements like the Me Too movement embody this wave's decentralized kind of structure. However, fifth wave feminism has also been critiqued for its focus on white women's experiences and voices, a problem that has plagued all feminist movements. Another generation of white women has failed to recognize the Black and Indigenous women whose theory was the so called bridge called my back, so to speak, to cite, of course, the seminal 1981 feminist collection that called on white women to address the invisibilized labor of Black and Brown women in their theory and activism. However, can we shift the discourse towards care, kinship, and healing while centering Indigenous and Black voices and away from feminist conflict? A parallel discourse has emerged on platforms such as TikTok, calling on women to decenter men. However, the limitations of this discourse show how the reproduction of Indigenous knowledge, void of the ecologies and communities that support matriarchal systems and peoples, is not generative. Calls to decenter men in our current society are calls to reform rather than calls for the abolition of patriarchy as a capitalist and imperialist settler colonial system. White women still see feminism as a fight for legal and reproductive rights or equality in Western society. This doesn't address systems of capitalism and colonialism that are the foundation for patriarchy in Western societies, and wastes time trying to reform systems that were developed to oppress women. Indigenous women who are feminists argue that patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism are inherently oppressive and cannot be reformed. They align with abolitionist movements calling for prison and police abolition and anti capitalist labor organizing, rather than seeking representation within oppressive institutions. Proponents of white matriarchy will often say that matriarchy does not reify focus on women and accepts that all bodies can enact rematriation. However, matriarchy does default to womanism, which is a field of thought based on justice in Black and Indigenous communities, with over 40 years of history in the US and Canada. Because womanism is a field that emerged in the 1980s, there have been generations of critiques about its return to gender binarism by creating a binary between the masculine and feminine within all creation, both of which are integral to gender balance in Indigenous communities, which is reinforced in Cree oral tradition, for example. The gender binary is actually a Western colonial concept. Before colonization, many Indigenous communities had members with a variety of genders and gender presentations. Indigenous trans feminism refuses the gender binary and compulsory heterosexuality as a colonial concept, calling for gender justice beyond the gender binary. Moving beyond woman centered feminism, Indigenous trans feminism is explicitly trans led and challenges gender binarism in feminist thought and action, even in Indigenous communities. For rematriation politics to enact change in society, they must center decolonization and Indigenous approaches to feminism, rejecting the white, Western dominance of earlier feminist movements. Mainstream feminism has co opted or even erased Indigenous concepts like rematriation, land stewardship, and kinship based governance. Walter Benjamin was a German Jewish philosopher, cultural critic, and media theorist. In his 1935 essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, Benjamin explores how mass media, often framed as a free market of expression, actually reinforces societal structures like race, gender, and class. He argued that mechanical reproduction of art through photography and film erodes its aura, or unique presence in time and space, detaching it from tradition and ritual. While this democratization of art enables new political possibilities, such as film's revolutionary potential, it also risks co optation for mass manipulation, seen most clearly in fascist aesthetics. Benjamin contrasts politically engaged art with fascism's aestheticization of politics, warning against spectacle driven control. Writing amid Germany's growing oligarchy and anti Jewish sentiment, he was witnessing both the mechanization of war and the use of mass media for propaganda. His work traces how reproduction has historically evolved, from engraving to lithography, then to photography, each stage diminishing art's uniqueness. With photography, images no longer require manual skill. With film, even time itself could be manipulated. This erosion of aura extended beyond art, disrupting cultural traditions by replacing singular rooted objects with endlessly circulated copies. At the time, our criticism was dominated by connoisseurship of white male scholars, who framed taste as something inherently accessible only through Western education. Benjamin, however, foreshadowed contemporary debates on AI and aesthetics, challenging rigid hierarchies of high and low culture. He anticipated how mechanical reproduction and later digital media would sever cultural practices from their origins, a process starkly visible in the erasure of indigenous matriarchal traditions within contemporary feminism. Matriarchal feminists in North America often strip indigenous matriarchy from its cultural context, reshaping it into a consumerable viral aesthetic rather than a lived governance system. Digital influencers seeking mass appeal reproduce a version of matriarchy that erases its deep relational and political functions within indigenous communities. This reflects what Benjamin argued: the mass reproduction flattens meaning, detaching knowledge from its origin in favor of spectacle. Marshall McLuhan, writing 2 decades after the Gutenberg Galaxy, expands on this idea, tracing how print culture reshaped human cognition, moving Western societies from oral, relational knowledge to fragmented linear thought. He contrasts this with indigenous oral traditions, which maintain interconnectivity. He warns that print, commerce, and centralized authority specialize knowledge, leading to division, echoing Benjamin's concerns about mechanization and abstraction. Similarly, digital feminism often perpetuates the very mechanization it critiques, appropriating indigenous intellectual labor while failing to recognize its origins. This mirrors Western individualism, where influence is prioritized over collective organizing and robust citation. In indigenous societies, knowledge is relational and embedded in community, whereas Western frameworks elevate individual expertise, often at the expense of the very communities from which knowledge is taken. Bell Hooks addresses these tensions in Yearning, Race, Gender, and Cultural Politics, arguing that Black women's intellectual and political work often happens in informal spaces, living rooms, kitchen tables, yet remains unrecognized by formal institutions. White matriarchs, positioning themselves as experts on matriarchy, reproduce the same racial and class hierarchies they claim to dismantle. Meanwhile, Indigenous women continue to live matriarchy, yet remain subordinated in the digital economy of feminist discourse.